Oh, welcome to another edition of City 101. Today we're going to do part 3 of what I called my tax trilogy shows. The first show, as you remember, was on estimated market values. Part 2 was on tax capacity. And today we wrap up the basic calculations of property taxes by talking about tax capacity rates. And that'll give you the final piece to the puzzle of how you can get a pretty good idea of what your property taxes would be. Now, as we started off and talked about in previous shows, you start with the estimated market value of your property, and that of course is determined by the county assessor or city assessor. From there you get a tax capacity value of your property, and again, as you remember, it's up to the first $500,000, it's 1% of your estimated market value would equal your tax capacity. And then you take the tax capacity figure and you multiply it by the tax capacity rate. And that's what we're going to be talking about specifically here. Now, what's a tax capacity rate? Well, a tax capacity rate is, for a lack of a more simple way to explain it, it's a multiplier. And every taxing jurisdiction in the state of Minnesota comes up with its own tax capacity rate or multiplier. And then ultimately what happens is all of the taxing jurisdictions in a locality, all of their tax capacity rates are added together for a one summary rate, and that's the multiplier that gets used. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. When we talk about the tax capacity rates, the city has a tax capacity rate, the county has, the schools have, and there's all kinds of miscellaneous taxing jurisdictions, from mosquito control districts to recreation districts. There's all kinds of other districts that could be used. But for an example that I'm going to use here, let's assume that there's a city, a county, a school, and just a total miscellaneous district. And let's say the city total tax capacity rate is 0.50 and the county is 0.45 and the school is 0.30 and all the other total miscellaneous districts are 0.15, and then that grand total is 1.40. Well, the next question you're going to have is, well, how did each of those taxing jurisdictions ever get to find out what their tax capacity rate was? Now, here's where I'm going to simplify it, just for the sake of folks being able to go through and get just a general idea of how to calculate taxes. But in its most simplistic form, what you're really looking at is what is the total levy that's being required by the taxing jurisdiction. For a city, it's what is your total levy? That would include your levy for your general fund, your levy for your bond payments, your levy for your capital equipment. All of those things equal a total levy. You then simply divide that total levy by the accumulated local tax base of a community. And we talked about, again, your market value and tax capacity. When you add those all together for a community, you have a total local tax base. Now, what I'm not going to talk about right here, because it's way too complicated for a show like this, there's a lot of additions and subtractions into local tax base. And they're very important for a city like Richfield, like fiscal disparities. That's going to be a whole other show. And tax increment financing districts. But let's set those aside for a moment and just talk about getting a total local tax base. So it's as simple as this. If a city had a total levy requirement of $12 million and their total local tax base was $24 million, you simply divide the 12 million by the 24 million, and your local tax capacity rate is 0.50. Now, that brings us to how do you calculate your property tax? Well, in the example that I put out a few minutes ago, if you took a $200,000 home and you multiplied by the 1% to get your tax capacity for that home, it turns out to be $2,000. If you take the $2,000 and then multiply it by the total tax capacity rate of the 4 taxing jurisdictions that I talked about a little while ago, again, that's the city, the county, the school, and the other, Remember, it added up to 1.4. You would simply multiply the $2,000 tax capacity of your home times the 1.4, and your property tax for the next year is $2,800. That's really as simple as it gets. If you wanted to know what the city portion of your taxes is, you would simply take the $2,000 and multiply it by the 0.50 portion of it. And that's the amount of your taxes that are going to the city. And the same holds true of using that same multiplier for the county, the schools, and the other miscellaneous taxing jurisdictions. Now, it gets more complicated when you start talking about commercial values, and there's a lot more detail that would go into this. But you know, the bottom line is fairly simple if you take a look at it. If you know what your market value of your house is, you know how to convert that estimated market value to a tax capacity, and then you find out what your local tax capacity rate is for all of your districts that for the locality that you live in, you should get a pretty good idea of what your property tax is. Now, again, there's all kinds of things that I haven't considered here. There's market value homestead credit, something that's being debated in the legislature right now, and all those kinds of nuances that will make some modifications to the number that you come up with, but you still ought to get a pretty good rule of thumb as to what your property taxes are with the simple formula that I just gave you in looking at tax capacity rates. You know, in a future show, we'll talk about more in detail about calculating tax levies and how you come up with a local property tax base. But each of those are really shows of their own because it gets fairly complex. But for right now, I think you've got the formula. When you get your property tax statement, and it ought to be coming out any day now, you should be able to take a look at that, take a look at the taxing jurisdictions, and get a pretty good idea of how your property taxes were calculated. Well, thanks for taking the time and looking at another show at City 101. And until I see you next time, take care.